Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salat wa salam ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to We Are Okay Wednesday. And this time we are doing the letter P for Panicky. We've been working our way from the letters A right through to Z, inshallah. So, have you ever had a time where you felt really panicky about something? It might have even come to the extent of it being a panic attack where you're struggling to breathe or having tingling sensation in your hands or even just feeling quite paralyzed. Well, I found that panic is really like fear on steroids. And when you start to understand how our feelings work and where it's coming from, that this shift in understanding can actually rectify or relieve us from reaching that stage of being panicky. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the clue in the Quran when he says that in the remembrance of Allah, do hearts find peace. And we'll get to that a bit later. I just want to share that the time when I had my very first ever panic attack. I was 21 and we were climbing in the Himalayas. And the day before we set off on a trek, because it was a 15 days trekking. So 15 days of hiking and camping through the Himalayas. And the day before we left, because we arrived early, we were taken on a bicycle tour of Kathmandu. And we were strictly told not to eat or drink anything on the tour, but we did. And I was incredibly ill. And so the very first night of camp, I was really struggling because we had like an Eskimo type tent. And so when I felt really ill, it was a real challenge to get out of the tent quickly. And I didn't sleep very much all night because I was really worried I wouldn't make it out of the tent. So the next day, we're walking and we're at the bottom of this massive slope. So initially it was sort of downhill, but then it came to a point where it was a very steep incline and very snowy. And I was so weak. Yeah, I didn't have any energy at all. I was walking with my mum, who was spurring me along, going, you can do it, you can do it. And when I saw that hill, I stopped being able to breathe. I didn't know what was happening. I was just unable to breathe. My mother, alhamdulillah, is a doctor. So she kept telling me, to focus on breathing out. Because one of the things that happens when we panic is sometimes our breathing gets confused and we don't realize our lungs are already full of air and that we need to breathe out before we can breathe back in. And so we're trying to breathe in to full lungs. And so it feels like we can't breathe. And so being aware of that, my mum talked me through it. And then she talked me through the rest of that day of slogging uphill through snow and stuff to get to our next campsite, because there was no turning back. Once you're out there, you're out there, right? You got to keep going. So alhamdulillah, understanding, for instance, that my lungs were already full of air and that I had to breathe out helped a lot, because one of the problems with having a panic attack is not knowing what is happening. It just exacerbates the fear, and so it increases it. And subhanallah, the 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 times now after since then that I've had those moments, I've known what to do, and it hasn't been as much of an ordeal as that first time that I had a panic attack. And there's a great story that you can find in our school site where all of these recordings are kept. I believe I was talking to Melissa for the peers for Panicky, and she was someone who really struggled with panic attacks and found this understanding really changed everything. In fact, she labeled the physiological symptoms as being thoughts with special effects, because we're always teaching that we're experiencing our thought in the moment. And so um, seeing it as being just a special effect of thought made the actual experience of it less scary, because part of the problem is the additional fear that we end up having because we're now, having all these crazy sensations and things happening in our body. So the first thing that I want to, I guess, focus on is the illusion of control and the role of that in panic. You see, if we believe that we have control and then things aren't going the way that we want them to go, then what can happen is there's a lot of fear, a lot of thinking, and that can lead to panic. What am I going to do? How am I going to manage this? It's not working out the way I expected. I'm not sure what to do. Like a lot of really active thinking that can really lead to feeling out of control and panicky. And what we're forgetting in that moment is, in fact, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one that's in control, and that Allah's plan is always the best plan. We're also forgetting the fact that Allah never burdens us with more than we can bear. So whatever it is in the different plan, it is something that we can handle. It's just in that moment, it doesn't look like it. And I think what we're sharing here today isn't about us never having a thought that we don't have a moment of fear around. It's more about actually noticing that thought and not then getting preoccupied with it or not allowing that fear to grow to the point of panic. For instance, the other day I had a situation where I had somehow someone do a transaction on my card that wasn't mine. It was nearly $500 worth. And so I then, what's the word? I'm quite tired this morning, as you're probably realizing from the way I'm coming across today, alhamdulillah. But disputed the transaction, that's right. And so so I got a refund for the transaction and a new card and all of that. Then a few days later, I went and looked at my account, and my account was overdrawn by 400 and something dollars. And when I saw that, I had a moment where I went like that, right? As you might, because it's like, why suddenly is my account overdrawn? So for whatever reason, they've retracted the refund, so I have to chase it up and figure out what's going on there. But in that moment, it was kind of like a panicky thought, right? Like, what's that about? But it only lasted a moment. It didn't become into a panic attack, or I didn't become panicky around it. And when I did see what happened, there was still some thinking around that. But because I am conscious and aware that everything is according to Allah's plan, that Allah is our Razak, He is the provider, that He's never going to burden me with more than I can bear, that thought didn't grow into becoming panicky. I remembered Allah, and that made a lot of difference in the moment. And so this is one of the key things, is that for us to shift from fearful or anxious thinking to a place of peace, it's about tawakkul. It's about reliance upon Allah, having trust in Allah, understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a plan. And whatever that plan is good for us, even if we don't like it, even if it doesn't feel good. There's something in it that's a benefit for us, because sometimes in those times when we don't like it and it doesn't feel good, that's when we're having the most growth, that we're actually shifting to becoming a better version of ourselves, because we're having to work through something that we're finding challenging. So shifting from a fear of the unknown to trusting in Allah's wisdom will transform panic to peace, just like it did for me when I noticed that transaction. Very quickly, after that anxious thought, it dissipated, because I thought about Allah, because I understood, where risk comes from, and it put my mind at rest, alhamdulillah. And so the key in all of it is coming back to this present moment, because what can happen, and if we can use that transaction as an example, is all the following crazy thoughts can follow, like, oh no, I needed that money because I've got the rent to pay, I've got all these bills. What am I going to do? Now it's in negative balance. I'm going to end up being charged interest. I'm taking a war against Allah. Can you see how now starting to creep into the future about what this particular thing means can just exacerbate the panicky thinking? SubhanAllah. So being grounded in this present moment helps us, or prevents us from our mind racing to the worst case scenarios. Isn't it interesting how we can go to worst case scenarios? But, in the reality, if we think about it, we're okay right now. I give you another example that I could have got quite anxious and panicky about. My husband is in Algeria at the moment. That's his home country. And by Monday evening, we hadn't heard from him for 4 days, which was unusual. He was usually sending WhatsApp messages to the kids and I, almost, daily. At least one of us would receive something, but none of us had received anything for 4 days, and he wasn't picking up the calls. And yes, I have to admit that there were some pretty big stories that came into my head, like, if something has happened to him, he hasn't given us a phone number to any of his family for us to find out. And he probably hasn't given, knowing him, our numbers to his family. So how would we know, right? If he's not answering his phone or replying to his messages, how are we going to find out if anything happened to him? And so those sorts of thoughts crept in. But I never reached the point of being panicky, because I put my trust in Allah, because I also understand that everything, including whatever is happening to him, is happening according to the qadr of Allah, and that I will know eventually what's going on. Now, it was disturbing my ibadah, because it was playing on my mind. And so I started making dua to Allah that I would find out soon, so that I could get on with being able to focus, because subhanAllah, it was challenging to focus while I was praying and things like that, while we didn't know. It was very, very late, I think Monday night, I finally got a message to discover he had actually been in hospital. So something did happen, but it wasn't the end of the world, and he was okay, and he's getting better, alhamdulillah. But the point was, under similar circumstances, it would be quite easy to let the mind run away to worst case scenarios and get quite panicky and spam call the number multiple times. I didn't spam call the number. I basically called his number pretty much every sort of 12 hours because they're in a different time zone to us as well. So every 12 hours, I was calling to see if I could get through because I figured if he was seeing my messages that he would reply. So there wasn't really much use spam calling. There wasn't much use getting myself worked up by trying and trying and trying and trying. The messages were there and he was in Allah's care. Alhamdulillah. And that's how I remained grounded. Yes, I was distracted. I wasn't able to focus as much as I normally would, but I was not panicky and or getting to any point of really anxiousness. I must say by Monday evening it was um escalating a little, but alhamdulillah, Allah answered my dua and I found out in a few hours that he was okay. So that's how it works. Our panickiness, I don't know if that's a word. I've just made it up now if it's not. Our panickiness, it's actually just a reminder that we've forgotten Allah, that we've forgotten that Allah is there. We've forgotten that Allah never burdens us with more than we can bear. We've forgotten that Allah is the best of planners, that He's the one that's in control. We've forgotten Allah. That's it. Not that we've forgotten Allah full stop across everything, but that we've forgotten Allah in this particular issue that we're thinking about. So I really want to emphasize that because when I say this, people go, yeah, but I'm mindful of Allah. I'm thinking of Allah. I'm not meaning that we're not thinking about Allah full stop. I mean, in the issue that we're getting panicky about, we've forgotten Allah. We're not seeing how Allah is there for you. Alhamdulillah. So, I do share my personal experiences to try and help unpack what I'm saying, and to also share that what I am saying I practice, what I'm teaching I practice, and that it is possible, and try and share examples where you could see, okay, yeah, it would be very easy to be panicky in that situation when somebody who normally would probably write to you at least a couple of times a day suddenly disappears for 4 days and isn't responding to anything. I one of the ways that I reminded myself when the mind started coming up with worst case scenarios was I would remind myself of other scenarios, like maybe something's happened to his phone, and because it's the weekend, maybe he couldn't get another phone. And so he's waiting to get another phone. And because Monday for us is still Sunday for him. So when it was Monday night was the beginning of Monday morning there. And so putting that sort of logical thing and really seeing that there are many other options for what might be happening compared to what the worst case scenarios that were popping up in my head helped a lot, because it helped me be grounded in the moment of going, look, there's no point having feelings about something that you don't know. When you know, if it is the worst case scenario, you're welcome to have the feelings then, but now is not the time to have the feelings. I'm talking to myself here. SubhanAllah. I do a lot of coaching myself. Alhamdulillah. So what I would like to do now is just open up for questions if anyone has any questions around being panicky. And if Aisha, if you're still here, yes, could you put the link to the school site, because that's where all the recordings are, because people might be in the WhatsApp group but not in school So we would like to put the link there so they can join and find the recordings if they're interested to see. I do think I want to check if it was Melissa's talk on panic that is in school, because it's a really amazing story of hers, her overcoming her panic. Just going there now. P is for Panicky, from Panicky to Peaceful. Let's see. Oh no, I didn't do it with Melissa. I did it with Aisha. So that would be a different story. We do have we do have Melissa's talk somewhere about panic if anyone's interested in it. So no one's got any questions? I'd love to hear some takeaways then. Is there something that yeah, I think we do have it somewhere. We can find it, inshallah. Does anyone have any takeaways? Anything that they found was interesting about what I shared? Anyone who doesn't think it's possible to not get panicky? Challenge me. I love a challenge.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
I guess the first thing that's popped up in my mind is so the fact that we don't have any control. I feel like I have a story of like, yo, Abdul Bari, you need to have full control in order to put all of your effort. So I guess how do you kind of dismantle that between striving and putting effort and not having that story of needing control to put in effort?
Because the focus becomes on showing up with ihsan and not on the result, because the result is always in Allah's hands. The thing you do have control over is how you show up, but not in how it turns out.
I see. I see. I see. And also, how do you dismantle that thought of defeated thinking? Because I feel like sometimes I fall into that trap of like, I don't have control. Okay, I'm victim and defeated and stuff like that.
Well, it's about realizing that it is just your thought, isn't it? If we are thinking that we are I mean, it's really, if you really want to break it down and turn it on its head and make it a bit scary, it really isn't an appropriate way to think about Allah and the qadr of Allah, to feel like you're a victim of your circumstances, is it? Because all of your circumstances are the qadr of Allah. And so you're saying that, Allah's made you a victim.
Oh, wow. That's powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I'd give you a bit of a shake.
Yeah.
I like doing that sometimes because when we realize that, because we get caught up in the way we're thinking about things, but when we realize that the way we're thinking about things is actually not really befitting of how to think about Allah, it does challenge our thinking. And that's what's needed, is a bit of a challenge to the way we're thinking. We're never a
Yes.
victim
And
of
Allah.
our circumstances. In the moment, okay, let's give a scenario. If somebody is actively harming you in this moment, in that moment, you are a victim of that person's harm. But are you a victim? I would argue that that depends on how you think about it. Because once it's finished, you're no longer being a victim, are you? It's not happening anymore. And so it's really important for us to challenge ourselves when we get caught up in our own pity parties about woe is me. Because it's not accepting the qadr of Allah, and it's important for us to appreciate that's all it is. and realize how important it is to accept the qadr of Allah.
And as you said, the qadr of Allah is not to make us victim. It's actually on the contrary to empower us, because if we were, for example, let's say quote unquote victimized by a situation, that's supposed to be a lesson learned to be even stronger. It's actually the opposite.
So I mean I am so in awe of the Palestinian people. And they have you if you want to say anyone has been a victim, you'd have to agree they've certainly been a victim of a lot, right? Yet when I see them setting up home in the rubble of their homes, and how beautifully they do it, and the smiles on their faces as they prepare what little food they have into whatever they can manage with whatever they can find that hasn't been destroyed. They're not sitting around being victims. They're living. They're actually living. And that just, I find that awe-inspiring. SubhanAllah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring them relief, because those that haven't even been able to go and find space in the rubble and are still out in tents are actually having a hard time, especially those that are getting flooded. And so there are plenty of them that are very much still suffering and struggling and cold and wet. So may Allah relieve them. But still their resilience, subhanAllah. Yes, they're living with conviction that there's an akhirah, and all this will be over eventually as we are travelers in this world. Absolutely. They are a remarkable example of that. But back to what we're talking about, and it is relevant to being panicky, because it's when we feel like it's out of control that we feel panicky. Most of these challenges that we go through are part of our test, aren't they? This life is a test. It's not meant for us to be a victim of it. It's meant for us to have opportunity to earn reward with our patience and perseverance, to learn from the experience and grow, to be a better person. I think also it inspires us to do good works for others who might be going through what we went through. I mean, that certainly drives me to do this work. My history, what I've been through, gives meaning to what I do. Might not feel like it when we're in the middle of it, but that's the bigger picture, subhanAllah. Well, we've got a minute left. I'd love to hear at least a couple of takeaways. Does anyone want to share a takeaway?
I do have one.
Go ahead.
SubhanAllah, I don't know how I made the link, but like how we're not responsible for the results, but also we have that verse that Allah does not burden a soul beyond what it can bear. Because we're not responsible of the results, and because we're not responsible of the outcomes, then there's that verse that Allah does not burden us beyond what we can bear. Because if on the flip side, if we were responsible for everything, then we would be burdened with everything. So I've never seen the link, and this is, as you were speaking initially, I just saw that link for the first time.
Alhamdulillah. Anyone else want to share? Aisha said she'll share hers in school. Sophie or Mahmouna, you want to share a takeaway? Well, in which case, inshallah, we will meet again next week for the letter Q, which is Q is for quarrelsome. And I think we can all be quarrelsome at times. So inshallah, we'll learn a bit more about being quarrelsome or not being, how not to be quarrelsome. Have a beautiful, blessed week. Quarrelsome, quarrel is like argue. So being argumentative. So a quarrel is an argument, and quarrelsome means somebody who is being argumentative. So on that note, subhanaka Allahumma bihamdika shada la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Have a blessed week, and I'll see you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.